Hi there fellow Kritans, guess what? I made an artwork. It's my first personal piece done in KRITA 5 since the timelapse recorder was introduced, so I believe you can already guess where it's all heading, right? Do you like watching timelapses? Cause I genuinely hate them. Like, okay, they may be fun to watch, sometimes you can spot a cool trick here and there, which may be worth trying out, but most of the time, I would just mindlessly stare at those seemingly random splashes of paint with no chance of replicating anything of what I see. So, having this in mind, I'll try to make this painting process video watchable even for a timelapse hater like myself. I'll do my best to turn it into a tutorial-ish thing by explaining what was happening inside my head during the process. So even if it's not a painting tutorial per se, maybe there would be some gain for you from watching an internet guy struggling to finish a piece. Oh, and I don't plan to add a cliché time-lapse background music in this video. Only you, me and my mumbling. Is that a deal? Cool! The process started as usual, with the blobs of colors that slowly has turned into characters.
Wait a second. I believe this is the part in which I should at least try to explain what on earth is happening here.
Okay, so when I was just starting out, that was one of the most confusing things I encountered. Like, everybody else just throws a lot of weird strokes everywhere, and suddenly everything starts to look valid on their side. But when I basically did the same thing, I was always left with just a mess that never turned into anything else. So, what actually happened there? I can't promise this comparison will work for you, but the best association I got for this process is imagining shapes in the clouds. Sometimes they just look like a dragon, whale, or anything your child mind could imagine back in the days. The major difference is that while painting, you can in fact affect the shape of the cloud. So, if you place a stroke correctly, the whale-shaped cloud starts to look even more whale-like, and vice versa. A bad stroke, and you're losing the resemblance. I would just try to add and subtract from this shape in different places. Sometimes it just looks worse and has to be undone, but some changes stick and make the whole shape look better afterwards. Apart from this shape, the second crucial thing I have in mind is the lighting. If somebody says that they like the colors in their artwork, they don't. You just didn't screw the light somehow. Long time ago I thought that light is just some sort of addition, where you make things lighter on one edge and that's it. But now, no. For each object material, I have to use two separate colors. One for the material if it's in the light, and one if it stays in the shadow. No matter where the light source is, about half of the object stays in the light and half doesn't. It is where you stand in relation to this light that makes you see a different chunk of the lead character. Hold the light torch in your hand and the whole outline becomes illuminated, even if the whole posterior area, is in the shadow. Place the light source on the side and you can see both halves. This one is physically valid, but a bit too specific and rare. The most common solution that works for me in most of the situations is just to place the light somewhere in between front and side, so that most of the visible shape stays in the light, but the shadow is still there, creating this nice balance between those two color families.
Yeesh, but how does this long monologue translate into dropping splashes of digital paint on the canvas?
Well, for each swatch of color I'll place, I need to ensure there is a similar but darker one on its side. As I've decided the light source to be on the right, the right blob is lighter than the left one. That's easier said than done, but it sort of makes things resemble some 3D objects. Well, kinda. Knowing what main rules I try to follow, let's give this lapse another try. As I am aware this is still quite chaotic, I hope you can see how I both work on the shape, while keeping those light and shadow parts clearly distinct from each other. They are obviously very different colors, but our minds are already treating them as parts of a single object. As my mind was slowly starting to see a character in those color blobs, I was also more sure of what shapes and proportions those lovely color nodes should have. Eraser mode and preserve alpha are your friends here, as they let you have the most basic control over both shape and insights. And you can switch between these modes so fast with keyboard shortcuts. Once I didn't have a better idea for this character, I moved on to the next one. You may notice that at first I didn't follow my lighting rule with lighter and darker blobs, which to be honest made the design so much more flat than the previous sketch. I think I was so busy designing where different objects would go that I didn't really notice this at first, but as the process goes, you'll see me fix that. Still, no excuses, shame on me. With this sketch being so rough and unfinished, it's quite easy to add new splashes of paint for some yet unspecified items, try out different colors for hair, paint and erase them to try different hairstyles, and so on. You can get really creative here. Another important advantage that we get with digital art are the tools for fixing proportions. You won't see this in this time-lapse, but I constantly stop and look for elements that could be of size or proportion that just feels off for some reason. You can't be like, hey, the eye of the character is a bit off, but overall I'm happy with how it turned out. Nah, it's just way too easy to fix not to fix it. Like you could move stuff with the Yama brush and then paint over the destroyed area. If you can't easily move it, then copy, paste, place where it needs to go, and then paint over and merge it down. Transform tool gives you multiple modes to get those proportions right too. Just don't let them be screwed up from the very beginning. For example here, by using the transform tool, I was able to move and rotate her arm and head, trying to make the pose a little bit better. And basically that was how the painting was going. At this point it was mainly about adding and removing stripes of material on her clothing, trying to find some order in this colorful mess. And then, look at this. Happy accident. While the overall clothing design was starting to look okay-ish, the lighting and color variety felt worse than on the previous character. I wanted to check how those blue areas would look like in green, so I've duplicated the whole layer and used a hue slider in the HSV adjustment filter. At first I wanted to remove everything apart from these areas, but hey, look at this. I quickly noticed that I could get more creative than that. Erasing resulted in both green and blue in the clothing design, and this really vibrant violet zone in her hair made everything look so much better. This accident changed quite a lot within a short time, and required some time to handle, as my brain started seeing even more potential elements in the clothing that I needed to figure out. Somewhere at this point I got this idea to seamlessly extend the violet hair onto some kind of cape. I've added a sash on her arm that fitted well as the part of her clothes and added a big blue blob in the background. It didn't correspond to any actual object, but it didn't have to. It just had to be there to compensate for the hair on the other side, and it fitted well with the blue elements already present in the design. But wait a minute, did I just make you watch a time-lapse for a few minutes? Aha, if I were you, I'd probably be already asleep. You know, time-lapse allergy. So let's take a break to speak about my main concern, which at this phase I had at the back of my mind. Basically, this artwork is still just a sketch. There is quite some info about how the character looks, but zoom in just a little and you can see how messy it is. Some unerased remains, incorrectly covered patches of color, big visible strokes. So let's fix them. No. My intuition forces me to do it, but this cake is a lie. Like, have you ever felt like your finished artwork looks worse than a sketch? That's discouraging as hell and it happens all the time. I believe that the reason for this to happen is that even if your brain is a lazy potato, it actually likes to imagine stuff, even if it's hiding it well. If you cover all the imperfections with precise and opaque brush strokes, I'd call it close the design, killing all the possible directions the artwork could go. With nothing left to imagine, it becomes a boring parody of its imperfect version from just some time ago. For me, the whole difficulty of rendering is to keep adding new, more specific elements while keeping as much of the mess below as possible. As the objects and shapes get smaller as I paint, I still try to create them the same way as when I was creating the initial sketch. Zoomed out, they look sharp and specific, but zoom in and you can see how messy and imprecise they truly are. And that's a good thing. But you see, even when you're aware of it, it's still so easy to fall into this trap. But luckily that's digital art, and we have the tools to avoid it. They are called layers. There are so many ways to organize your layer stack, each with its pros and cons, but the solution that works best for me goes like this. I use one layer for each big object. But with big object, I really mean it. Like this whole character for me is a big object, and only later in the process there will be more of those. But why? It's so much easier to edit things when they are separated, right? Well, if I decide that some part of a layer needs layer-specific operation, it's not such a hassle to select it, cut the content to a different layer, perform the operation, and then merge it back to the origin. The advantage, however, is that I don't need to think too much about keeping a very precise and complex layer structure. And with it being so simple, once in a while, and especially every time I start doing something risky, I can duplicate this whole layer and hide the original one. This creates an easily accessible history of what happened to the object. Apart from constant mirroring to ensure my mind doesn't get used to proportioning mistakes, and soft proofing with grayscale to ensure the values are clear and easy to read, I'd also compare my newly added details with my previous, more sketchy version of the object. If it looks worse than before, well, you sorta shouldn't keep it. This might sound terrible that you need to constantly lose your progress, but it's something I got used to over time. If you analyze well enough what went wrong and what juicy mess underneath you just lost, you can copy and paste just the fragment of the previous version, paste it above the new one, and partially erase it, keeping only the better part of each version. You can also copy it somewhere near and use it as a reference image to avoid making the same mistakes again. But yes, of course, sometimes you just screw up the render so much that it has to be done from scratch. But you get better with each failed attempt. So stay strong and don't allow bad rendering to destroy your artwork. Staying on the topic of, let's call them reference backups, apart from using layers, once in a while I would use save as to create a backup file. I believe this is important to keep enough backups in case the file gets corrupted or you just do something stupid. But it also creates a great opportunity to get rid of most of those history layers. The files get much smaller and you have this whole history safe on your disk. Okay, that's enough theory for now. Let's go back to the time-lapse. As the core of the design was done, and the shape started to really resemble specific objects, I faced a serious problem. This time in world building instead of painting itself. As the whole painting session was improvised, without any specific topic in my mind, I had no idea of what character I was actually designing. And at this point, I should kinda be using this information to drive the process. I mean, it's not about creating a whole lore about it, but I needed anything to which I could find associations, or I would end up with another generic warrior princess, or something in this territory. Here is mine then. Her name is Nala, and Nala hunts for sea creatures. At first, I thought she's gonna be a fisher, but sea monster trapper was so specific that, well, it's quite amazing how fast you start to understand what gear she may need. I quickly added the fish in her hand, and some cylindrical containers for even more fish. Trying to think of all the associations I got with sea trapper, I also added some basket on her back, tried to design some quiver with seashells. Well, this did not work that well. But the starfish in her hair? Brilliant, it made into the final piece. This whole concept also changed Nala's outlook a little bit. Nothing drastic, but as she's more of an action character now, I made her hair shorter and more organized. They're still fancy as hell, but I believe they look less like the warrior princess hairstyle. I've decided not to overload her with a huge amount of jewelry like bracelets and necklaces. Like, the design should be cool even if it's not practical, but hey, she looked dope even without those cliches. I also didn't want to weaponize her with too many knives and javelins. Her skirt was turned into short trousers, as this felt less generic for a female character. If there was one moment where I started to regret I'd made her a sea trapper, it was when I worked on a damned fish. What is a damned fish and why is it damned? Well, do you sometimes have an artwork element that you can't do well even after multiple attempts? So you already know. Like, I hardly ever name layers, but this time I had to name the object layer the damned fish. Here is how bad it got. First, I just painted a generic catched fish for Nala to hold. First problem was that the fish, hanging directly under her hand, would interfere too much with her skirt of the same color. But that was okay. I moved it farther from her body. That required introducing some device to connect her hand with the fish, as the fish was no longer hanging underneath it. But it has to look good even if it's not too practical, so it was okay. This problem was to be fixed with adding Nala's stuff later in the process. But as the element is placed so much in the front, being a big light area on a contrasting dark background, it draws a lot of attention, so I couldn't really allow it to be too mediocre. First attempt didn't go very well. I liked those flat spiky surfaces around the fish head, but as a whole it wasn't looking fishy at all, and it looked like it was facing the wrong direction. Then I decided to start again, copy-pasting only the topmost part of the head, and tried to add some fins. Those evolved into a design based on a stingray, which at this point felt much more interesting for me than a usual, fish. I accepted this solution, removed Nala's sash to not interfere with my newly designed nice prey, and finally decided how the stuff that supports it should look like. And I don't know, maybe I should have accepted this simple but specific enough design of the stingray, but for some reason it didn't feel good enough for Nala's design, which looked a bit more solid. So I kept on changing things and working on its 3D form. Once again I tried to use the hue shift trick and started adding dark lines. Sharp on top and soft on the bottom. That would divide the stingray body into separate modules. Not like actual stingrays look like, of course, but it was supposed to be a fantasy creature, so everything allowed. And yeah, maybe at this point again I should have left the design as it was. But nah. After just trying some other forms, I got this idea to turn its tail into octopus-like tentacles. And it's probably over-designed, and the initial stingray thing would be just fine. But after all, I said that every design you do makes you a little bit better in general, right? When you have multiple designs, it costs more time, and it may be hard to decide which one you should pick, or how to combine them properly. So many decisions to make. But at least for me, it's still better to have this than accept a mediocre solution as a good enough solution. But I don't know. Maybe, after all, I like to do the same stuff over and over again. Now let's sum up how I tackled rendering of Nala. The biggest problem I faced here was the shadow casted on her by, yeah, you guessed what causes all the painting problems. The damned fish. You see, something I didn't notice, or maybe I didn't want to notice, is that the stingray design, apart from looking cool, expanded horizontally so much that it should cast a huge shadow on Nala's body. So I had to decide. Either I accept it as it is, being readable but physically inaccurate, or I do it correctly, losing several details and unnecessarily complicating the composition. This obviously should be handled on a sketch phase, when I could even change the light direction to fully omit the problem, but as it was already too late for that, I took the challenge and tried to find a solution that would look correctly without destroying the readability. First attempt. I used the fish layer copy, turned it black and set it to overlay mode. But as it often does with the damned fish, it didn't work very well. So I tried another approach. I used this layer as an outline and manually repainted her clothing, so that I use only the colors reserved for materials in the shadow. I warped it a bit to show her 3D form, and left some areas being lit. You know, I don't need to be 100% physically accurate, but I do need to somehow show the 3D form. The rest of her clothing was pretty straightforward. As I've mentioned before, I tried to make the elements clearer on what form they have, but with details still being quite messy when zoomed in. Also with no new contrasty colors that weren't in the initial design of the element. You don't want to suddenly draw attention to the zone, which didn't draw attention on a sketch phase. Nala hands really show I didn't do my proco homework right, but they turned acceptable after using photo reference. I mean, acceptable for me. Backgrounds are always a little bit tricky in a way that if you want to actually paint them instead of just leaving big splashes of paint, they consist of so many different elements, requiring a lot of work both in painting alone, as well as in moving them around to make the composition look well. Once I've cropped the artwork to vertical proportions, I did this trick with Nala's reflection on the ground and adding a lighter area right under the character. I think it creates a great contrast with the character shadow. A fast change, but felt like a big improvement in this zone. In the initial sketch, I only had those cylindrical containers that looked a bit like drums, creating some sort of an arc pointing to my character. And I was quite sure I wanted to keep them in the final design. There were also green and blue blobs that only hinted some elements that were left to be designed. I did some research on Google and Pinterest of sea creatures in general to get some ideas of what all those elements could turn into. The blue one looked like a tail of something similar to a whale, so I decided to make it resemble it more. Remember? Sculpting the cloud, making it look more like a whale. The background was evolving quite well, although with many tough decisions to make. I wasn't sure if the left purple blob should also be another whale tail, or a head of this huge octopus to which the tentacles on the front belong. I've also spent quite a lot of time just moving those things around, duplicating them and making different designs on them. But I think it paid off. As I was moving them around, the blue one, after placing it up, started to look more like a jellyfish than the whale tail. But I liked this idea so much that I let it stay this way. The tentacles definitely needed much more work on this stage. Soon it turned out to be this strange looking creature, which I really liked and decided to keep. I was also very happy with the tentacle on a drum, which had this clear division of light and shadow area. Shadow being casted by Nala, white highlight showing off its slimy material, as well as the blue reflection in the shadow area. This is one of those non-essential areas that suddenly turn out much better than expected. It's good to find a way to make them pop a bit more in the end. And that's what I did. I removed the elements in similar color from its surroundings, avoiding the same type of confusion as the damned fish created being too close to the blue skirt. Okay, so let's sum up the whole background composition I ended up with. Nala's face is the lightest part in the top center area of the canvas. All of the background elements directly around her are much darker, even darker than her shadow area. This way, they don't interfere with her in any significant way. You can look at her without any distractions. This also applies to the area near her hand and her legs, and what's great is that it makes sense, as they are in the shadow casted by Nala. I agreed to have this very light stingray on the front, as it is no longer covering the main character. Light background elements are allowed only on the top right and bottom left zones. They can get your attention, but with this big dark zone behind the character from top left to bottom right, they should make your focus rotate around, always making your sight go back to the center. There are so many other small and big decisions I had to make in the process, but this video got rather long anyway, so let's not make it even longer. I hope that this video form was an interesting insight of how my process looks like. I think it shows how messy it sometimes can be, and how you don't just end up with the final design from the very start. It's a real process with effort, struggles, much more thinking than my potato brain would like, in which you'll make decisions, make mistakes, and sometimes have to go back a little bit. All for the greater effect in the end, of course. And hey, I'm pretty happy with some of the elements here. I'm not a character designer, but after all it doesn't feel that generic for me. Let me know whether you like this artwork or the video in this format. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this video. Have a lot of fun painting and see you soon. Cheers!